Hello, I'm Dr Jodi Richardson, and you're listening to Well, Hello Anxiety, a podcast where we end the struggle with anxiety and build our toolkit of practical skills to thrive. Anxiety is driven by uncertainty. What's going to happen with an interview, a date, my relationship, my work, an exam, my children, medical test results? Situations like these cause anxiety because of the unknown, which is why, in the wake of a global pandemic, the number of people experiencing debilitating anxiety is unprecedented. Welcome back to Well, Hello Anxiety. I'm your host, Dr Jodi Richardson, an anxiety speaker and educator and the best-selling author of Anxious Kids and Anxious Mums. Today, we are talking about certainty, anxiety, and coping when things are not in our hands, when things are out of our control, as they so often are in this thing we call life that's filled with lots of curveballs. I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest. We're going to learn a lot together from Dr Toni Lindsay. She is a clinical psychologist and a specialist in the area of adolescents and young adults with cancer. She is the author of The Certainty Myth, and she is here with us. And where are you joining us today from, Dr. Lindsay?
I am actually in Sydney on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. And so I'm very, very excited to be here and chatting with you.
Oh, thank you for joining us. And if you could tell us a little bit about sort of your journey to this conversation here today, what led you to write the book, The Certainty Myth?
So probably the answer to that question is a bit of a long and rambling one. But if I go kind of back to the beginning of my career, I guess I kind of initially worked in an adolescent space and then in adolescents with cancer. And then for the last kind of 14 years or so, I've been working in a hospital, working in oncology and what we call psycho-oncology, which is the mixture of psychology and oncology work together. And so one of the things that shows up very, very consistently, in fact, there is rarely a conversation I will have with someone around this space that doesn't involve uncertainty. And so that comes about for a few reasons. The not the least of which is that one of the ways that cancer shows up for people is people tend to be kind of wandering through their lives, doing what they do, and then all of a sudden cancer will arrive. And sometimes that's, people have been unwell, and this might kind of instill a little bit of fear and anxiety for people. But sometimes people are just kind of walking through life and they're totally fine. They might go for a routine test often comes up when people go to give blood and, they'll then get this phone call saying, oh, there's something wrong. And in that instant, people's worlds go from this sense of actually, I'm in control. I know what's happening. I've got agency. Everything is kind of bad things happen, but they don't happen to me. And then very quickly, that entire frame shifts and people find themselves in a space where everything they thought to be true feels very untethered and disconnected. And, this kind of funny space of like, well, if this foundational thing that I thought was something, then how do I make sense of the rest of my world in that context? And of course, what we know is, and we kind of know this in an intellectual way rather than in an emotional way, but we know that our worlds are never that thing, right? But we feel like we believe that they are.
Yes.
We all know that stuff happens to people. We've all had experiences of that thing kind of being really unexpected. I love that line in the Sunscreen song, and I'm probably showing my age a little bit here, where, there's that line where it's like, the things that you worry about are never going to be the big things. It's going to be the thing that kind of blindsides you on some random Tuesday afternoon that you never see coming. And we know that, and we know that kind of in a really cognitive way, but the actual lived experience of that thing showing up feels really different. And so one of the things that I guess I noticed both in myself, but not only in my patients, but in my colleagues I think this had kind of started a little bit before the pandemic because we'd had bushfires and we had a bunch of other stuff kind of going on that was making people kind of a little bit less certain about things generally. And then the pandemic obviously is this exemplar of how do we kind of make everyone feel really uncertain and really untethered. And so I was noticing that these conversations that happen in my clinic room then started happening all around me. And I would say actually that has continued. And I see this in my patients often, is once you've experienced a sense of uncertainty, then it's really hard to unsee that thing. And so that thing then tends to show up in other spaces. And as you were speaking in the intro, I was actually thinking to myself, this uncertainty, when it turns up in these really big ways around pandemics and other things, we can name that thing really quickly and we can kind of hang our hats on it. But this stuff shows up equally in our everyday around relationships or jobs or decision making around, I remember once seeing someone who was completely paralyzed by the idea of what school she was going to send her kids to because she didn't want to make the wrong decision but didn't have all of the information. And so the uncertainty part of that was kind of really paralyzing for her. And so this stuff is showing up. It's just that when it shows up in a big way, we're much better at recognizing it.
And I think too, when it shows up in a big way, we're all very much connected by it. So it's a shared experience, isn't it? Whereas when it's that lump you might find in your breast alone in the shower, or you see something in your life that's happening that makes you think differently about somebody or a situation, or you receive an email that's unexpected that just makes your stomach sink, and that what was once certain is immediately anything but. Is it reasonable to say that it's much harder? It's still hard when it's a shared experience, but it's harder in a different way when it's just us. It's just us and maybe our mortality, maybe our future, maybe something to do with our children. How do you find that comparison works?
I would largely agree with that. I think if we think back to, we're going to way back land now, right? But, if I think about how we've evolved and how our brains are kind of geared, there's a couple of fundamental pieces in that. And there's one which is actually the foundation of why this uncertainty stuff is problematic for us, because it's always been adaptively helpful to be able to recognize certainty, particularly if that certainty is something that's about to eat you. So we're really good at recognizing that thing, which is why when we sit in the gray between something that feels certain and uncertain, that's a really, really tough space to sit. And all of our evolution is kind of working against us in that moment, and which is why our anxiety systems kind of all fire. But the other kind of fundamental thing that we have as part of our evolution is that we're a social animal. And so the process of that socialness actually means that when these things happen to everyone, we take comfort in that and we're able to kind of recognize that thing much more readily. And so I often, one of the programs that I work in with young people with cancer is that most of, and this is probably true for all people living with cancer actually, is that it's really easy to feel like they're the only person on the island.
Yeah.
And so one of the most powerful things that happens, we build all of these beautiful centers and all of these spaces, which are lovely and great, of course. But the most powerful thing that happens is a young person sees another young person walking down a corridor and it's like, oh, I'm not the only person on the island. I don't even need to have a conversation. I just know that you're there.
Yes.
And often I'll say, do you want to meet that person? Like, I can sort that out. And they're like, no, it's okay. I don't need to have a conversation. And so I think, to your point, the things that have happened to us as a whole community, and that's a whole global community largely over the last couple of years, there's been, for many people, that's actually been a really helpful tool in being able to name some of these difficulties because they're seeing these things play out. Whereas I think if you're the person who's trying to hold all of this and trying to contain it, it's really easy to feel like you're the person that's going mad and why can't I just cope and why is this so hard for me? Whereas if you're seeing that reflected all around you, it's much, much easier to say, you know what, I'm struggling with that too, and that's okay.
Yes, it is that shared experience and connecting with other people who get it, they're going through it. It's hard. Doesn't stop it from being hard, but it's a burden easier to carry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that the people that I work with and what I've noticed kind of in the world around us in the last couple of years is that we are inherently adaptable creatures. And so when this stuff turns up, initially we often don't know what to do with it. But then when we have to sit with it for a while, it's kind of like, oh, okay. Oh, that's that uncertainty thing again. Okay, cool. Well, what do I do with that? And so I think there's been a couple of dual processes happening over the last couple of years. You mentioned in your intro, the rates of anxiety are much higher. And that's because there's been some really legitimate reasons for people to feel way more anxious over the last couple of years. But I also wonder whether the flip side of that is there's been much more communication. There's been much more kind of public dialogue around anxiety. I remember early on in the pandemic, people talking about not only the health crisis of this, but the mental health crisis of this and and we're now seeing the sequelae of that kind of play out over the years. And I suspect the fallout of this is going to be much, much longer than we anticipated. I think everyone thought that this would all be wrapped up pretty quickly. we were obviously all wrong.
All
Um,
wrong. Yes.
or we're very, very wrong. But, even I was having a conversation with someone yesterday and they were saying, I had the illusion that 2022 was going to be easier. And actually, I got to the end of the year and was completely smashed and realized actually it was harder because some of the
Mm,
structure that had kept us contained for that couple of years of crisis mode actually had lifted a bit, which then actually makes things more difficult to manage. And so I think actually having language around this stuff is really powerful. And part of the impetus around kind of actually naming this and writing the book was actually, I want people to recognize that this is a very universal experience and that if you're struggling with this thing, not only is it not a bad thing to be struggling with, and I don't mean that in the sense that it's not uncomfortable or it's not difficult, but I mean that this is an innate part of us being humans.
mm.
And so having some tools and strategies to manage that is a really, I would like people to approach this stuff as okay, how do I make a friend of uncertainty rather it being than their enemy? How do I kind of reconcile those spaces a bit more?
Yes. And when you're working with a patient and you need to deliver the news that this person has a cancer diagnosis, how do you help that person move from that initial diagnosis, that news? There's the before and then there's the after. And this idea that we get used to a new normal, don't we, when we're living with uncertainty? But it's very uncomfortable. And one of the things that we can all do to cope better is to build our willingness, like you say, to befriend the uncertainty. Not that we welcome it, we don't want to sort of roll out the red carpet, but certainly it can change the way we get through each day and continue to live our lives when we can handle it differently. How do you support patients to come to terms with the news and help them to build these skills to live with this uncertainty that is going to be in their immediate future and will be with them for some time?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of me is forever grateful that I'm not the person who actually has to deliver that news. I'm just
Right.
on there kind of, when people have already, and often, quite thankfully, actually, by the time I meet people, they've often had a bit of time to process this stuff.
Yes.
That doesn't always happen, but I actually think there's a huge part of this. Our tolerance as a society for discomfort and this kind of perceived sense of not coping is really low.
Mm.
And so if I think about a person who's just had a diagnosis, or often the times when there isn't much time between when someone gets news and when I see them, might actually be a patient who I already know who's been given that something's changed or things aren't going well. And so it's actually really important and really human of us to need time to process those things. And I think we're often a little bit hard on ourselves. And this extends not only into the cancer space, but around grief, around, the loss of a job, around, a million other things, is that actually it's our job to turn up and be really vulnerable and be really terrified and to have anxiety about the future. If I meet a patient who has gotten, say, a cancer diagnosis and they're not anxious and worried about the future, I'm worried about them. Like something has
Yes.
gone wrong. And so there's a bunch of emotions and they're big emotions that show up around this stuff. And there's the obvious ones that we think about, which might be about kind of anxiety and worry and other things. But there's equally things like guilt or shame or concern for other people or, a bunch of other stuff that will show up in that as well. It sounds really odd, but, I had a conversation with a patient of mine a little while ago who had been told that his disease had become terminal and they weren't able to do anything further. And I'd kind of gone into the session, he was a patient I'd known for a very long time. I kind of went into the session expecting that the conversation we would have would be about how terrible all of this was. And he actually said to me, I just feel relieved because I've been waiting for this for 5 years and now it's come
Ah,
and I can make sense of it. And so the stuff that shows up in this space for people is often kind of, even after all of these years, I can predict some of it, but lots of it is just like, oh, didn't see that coming.
yes.
But I think like the really important piece in that, and to your point around what do you do with that? When I'm sitting in a clinic room and someone's walked in and they've just had, the worst day of their lives, all we can do with that is to be present to it.
Mm.
We can't fix it. We can't change it. I might have some little tips and tricks around what do you do for the next day or the next hour or the next whatever. But the reality is, we're sitting in the face of this thing that's unchangeable. And it's a really human thing to turn up and to have an emotional response to that. It's also a really human thing on my part and, anyone else who sits in this space to show up and to want to fix that.
Mm.
We often have this tension between, as much as the person sitting in front of me wants me to jump in and come up with some solutions, I also want to jump in and come up with solutions. But we both know that that's not a helpful path to tread.
Yes, it's human nature, isn't it? And it's a conversation that I've been having here at home, even on a personal level with my husband, because I know what I want and need when something goes wrong, no matter what it is, no matter where it sort of falls on the scale of things that can go wrong. Really, fundamentally, what I want is validation and empathy. Just someone to say, that sucks, or I'm so sorry. And I share a bit of a joke when I'm presenting about when that didn't happen in a big way here, and with his permission, because yeah, he's very good like that. He's happy for me to talk about it. But it's human nature, and I found myself even, and he might gently point out every now and again where I've jumped to Mrs. Fix-It mode. I've wanted to make a difference, and it comes from the pain we feel of seeing somebody we love and care about suffering, doesn't it? We feel it, we want to do something to make a difference. But like you say, the most important thing we can do is just be present and give them space to feel what they're feeling and be there with them.
Absolutely. And I would say that equally extends from whether it's a therapist or whether it's a kind of healthcare worker of some other flavor, or whether it's a family member or a best mate or whoever. One of the things that my patients consistently will say to me, and this is about managing our own discomfort, our own uncertainty, right? Is, one of the things that my patients will often say to me is, I just want them to hear me. I don't need to be told about the diet that's going to cure my cancer or the why I just need to be positive and to not think about this stuff and, whatever it might be. It's just like, I just need them to be there and to go, okay, that sucks.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things that happens when kind of people turn up with a diagnosis of this, and, I see people with a whole spectrum of things, right? So some of the people I see, I can absolutely, at the time of meeting them, be relatively certain that everything is going to be fine. They're going to go and live really happy and productive lives. And thankfully, when you're in a space for long enough, you see that turns up more and more now than what it used to, which is awesome.
Yes.
But there are invariably people that I meet that from the day they're diagnosed, they know that their time is short. And that's a really, really powerful thing. And one of the things that comes up over and over again in conversations with people that I have with people is that therapy space might be the only space there that they can truly kind of name that, because the rest of the world can't tolerate it.
Yes.
So I have had patients in the past where they've wanted to give away their stuff because their stuff's really meaningful and they want to kind of share it with whoever. And they've, gone through the process of going, oh, such and such would really like my camera, or this thing would be meaning, or, we went and saw this movie together, so I want to give them this thing. And so they want to go through that process because that process is really important to them. But they might go to that person and say, hey, I just really want to give you this because it's really important and the relationship we've had is really important and blah, blah, blah. And invariably that person will say, oh, you don't need to think about that. Everything's going to be fine.
Oh.
And so
Yes.
I think one of the things that we can take away from this about whether this is cancer stuff, because obviously this life and death mortality stuff is the pointy end of life.
Yes.
But this stuff shows up in our everyday, right? How many conversations do we have where someone, it might be a work colleague, comes to you with some kind of personal problem and we jump in and we try and fix it, or we try and like placate them, or we try and make it better, or it's like, no, just hear them. Let them say what they need to say and that's okay.
Yes. There's a beautiful video that Brene Brown has published, and it's just a short excerpt from a presentation she delivered. And she said, sometimes the best thing we can say is, I don't know what to say right now, but I'm just so glad you told me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
With uncertainty, can you talk to us, please, about uncertainty and anxiety? Because we know that the brain and body's response when it comes to anxiety is all about anticipation of a threat. So help us make the connection between these two things.
Well, depending on who you ask, you could almost say that these kind of things are largely interchangeable. I noticed when I sat down to write the book, I started talking a lot about uncertainty, but very quickly that turned into a lot of discussion about anxiety, because they are
Yes.
actually fundamentally the same thing.
Yes.
I often think about uncertainty as being kind of the thing that we see, right? there's a tangible situation or an event or a something that showed up. Anxiety is the thing underneath that. So the driver, if you will. And then probably underneath that, if we want to get into a kind of probably a slightly more existential discussion, probably the thing under that is fear of death. And so there's these kind of worries that we have around uncertainty, and the kind of anxiety stuff is invariably about these ideas of terrible things happening to us in the future,
Mm.
in whatever flavor. And so some of those might seem more innocuous than others. So, I hasten to use the word pandemic because I think everyone's pretty fatigued by it. But it's a great example of like, it's really easy to catastrophize what's going to go wrong with a pandemic, right? And it wasn't in our heads, right? Like people were being really clear to us about this thing is
Yes.
really bad. And so different people conceptualize that uncertainty in different ways. So for some people, that showed up as moving towards a really strong control agenda. For some people, that showed up around avoidance. For other people, it showed up around hypervigilance and other things. But all of those things are kind of anxiety flavored stuff, just different mechanisms of that. But that same thing shows up when we think about a relationship breakdown, for instance. There's the actual relationship breakdown itself, then there's the grief about the relationship, but then there's the thoughts about that thing. And so those thoughts are often things around, I'm never going to meet anyone again. I'm going to be alone forever. I'm going to die alone. All of this stuff that kind of plays out in our anxiety brain. And, I often think about that kind of little anxiety guy that sits on our shoulder and kind of has a bit of a natter with us. Sometimes that anxiety guy and the uncertainty guy look almost identical. And so I think one of the really powerful things that people can do around this is actually just recognizing that those guys have showed up. Even if you never do anything further with it, just kind of going, oh, it's the uncertainty that showed up here. That's what's making me feel really anxious and kind of worried. Or, that anxiety stuff showed up, but I don't know what's going on. It's like, oh, actually, that's the anxiety that shows up around this uncertainty stuff. So actually kind of recognizing those guys. One of the things that happens as we get older is that we get better at recognizing those kind of guys that show up in our brain. Whereas for adolescents and young people, sometimes it's never come up, so they've never really thought about it. But it's really, really powerful that even in just naming or identifying, or if you want to get a picture of those guys, and I say guys not in a gender specific way, just in a way that's usually how people describe them. It's like, oh, the anxiety guy or the whatever.
Yes.
But seeing those guys and knowing that they show up, you can then change that relationship to those guys kind of really differently, which is a really helpful thing. So there's lots of steps that happen after that, but kind of, that old AA thing that shows up in a million kind of movies and things around, like, the first step is recognizing that there's a problem
Yes.
with this stuff. The first step is recognizing that uncertainty has showed up.
Yes, I had an experience just this morning, and I won't say too much because it's not my story to tell, although it is from a parent's point of view, that something came to my attention in the car on the way to school this morning, and it made me feel uncertain, and the anxiety built, and I decided to ask this particular child to stay in the car after the other child hopped out. And what I realized I was doing in that moment was I was recognizing that I'm anxious about this, and the uncertainty about this particular piece of information that I'd learned on this journey was such a weight for me to carry. I know I can recognize, and I knew at the time, I wanted to have a conversation because I wanted a little bit more information, because I knew that that would help me cope with the day, even though I knew that this child of mine was going to cope no problem. And I could tell by the way that they were talking. But sometimes that happens, doesn't it? That something's happening for someone else. And it goes back to your point about patients and their family and friends, that sometimes it can be happening for our children or our partner or our parent or our colleague or a friend. And we would do well to recognize what's happening for us and to be able to sit with that discomfort. And I'm very good at sitting with discomfort for my own stuff, but it's a next level when I start to become anxious about things for other people that I care deeply about. And I knew that my questioning this morning wasn't going to cause any more stress for this child of mine, but it did just give me a little bit more insight into what was happening, which was my natural attempt to try to help myself feel better, I think, because I can talk about it more later with this particular child. But yes, anyway, it's interesting how it shows up for us, isn't it?
And I think definitely that one of the things that's really common in this uncertainty space is that almost want to say like reassurance seeking or validation, right? Like we go very quickly to I need to get more information, I need to find out, I need to get be able to confirm that. And it sounds like that's some of what played out for you this morning around asking the
Yes.
further questions. It's really common. I see people in my clinic room who've had something happen, and this does not is definitely not limited to cancer. We all do this, where someone's had something or they've gotten a piece of information, they maybe haven't understood it, or it's caused this kind of anxiety thing. So their first response is to go to Google and to come up with, get more information. But it's a bit of a false economy because what tends to happen is A, Google's, in lots of ways very helpful, but in lots of ways really unhelpful.
Yes.
But the kind of piece that then follows that is invariably in looking for that reassurance, a bunch more questions will arise, which then kind of reinforce this kind of reassurance seeking cycle. And we saw that very much around the pandemic stuff where people were watching, hours and hours of news every day and going really deep into rabbit holes around, there was a bunch of stuff that showed up around vaccines and other things because in trying to get rid of the uncertainty, people seek certainty. So, of course, this idea of I'll be able to find some concrete answer. But what we know is that there is absolutely some situations where uncertainty shows up, there's a really concrete answer, and that thing will disappear.
Yes.
But most of the time, that's not what happens. I remember many, many years ago, a colleague of mine talking about the difference between grieving the loss of a relationship by, someone cheating on someone or breaking down or whatever versus the grief of a relationship around someone dying. And one of the things that came up in that was they're inherently both really, really painful, but there's a different level of certainty around what's happened
Mm.
there. If someone has died, you have to process the death. It's just what you have to do and you have to make sense of that. Whereas the kind of uncertainty or the kind of shifting and changingness of a relationship that has ended, even though there's another, and that other human is maybe at the same coals that you're going to be at, there's a whole other piece that shows up around that. And of course, losing a partner to death is horrendous, but the mechanisms by which we deal with those things are quite different.
Yes. And when the partner, like you say, could be at the local supermarket, there's so much uncertainty around the breakdown of the relationship, but also when am I going to see them? Are they going to be with a new partner? What's it going to be like? And that's anxiety, isn't it? It's the worry about the future, the what if questions, the catastrophic thinking, and then all of the physical sensations and all of those biological changes that we experience with a racing heart and changes to our breathing and changes in neurochemistry and perspiration and nausea and all of those things.
Yep.
It just feels so awful. It's so, and what I love to say to people is, yes, it does feel awful. But as you said so beautifully before, when we understand it, we can see it for what it is, we can recognize it, we can name it. Hello, anxiety, hence the name of the podcast. Then we know that it's not dangerous. Then that in itself can help. But what other strategies can you recommend? Or is there one in particular that you'd like to share with our listeners today so that they can sort of add another tool to their toolkit when it comes to uncertainty and anxiety?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think different things work for different people, obviously. And I guess probably in listening to the podcast, I guess one of the things that I'd really like people to take away is that this isn't something to be fixed. It's something that we live with and that's okay. And, I see that play out with lots of people I talk to where they just kind of get to build that relationship with uncertainty and go, okay, you've showed up again and that's okay. I guess the thing that most people I talk to find most helpful is in recognizing that all of this uncertainty stuff is future based. And whether that's big uncertainty or little uncertainty or whatever combination, and that's equally true of anxiety. We tend to be anxious about stuff that hasn't happened yet. And so, one of the most effective ways of managing that is actually coming back to the here and now and just being really present to, okay, in this moment, what do I know? And what do I know for sure? If we go on our theme of relationship stuff, the thing that you might know in the moment is my relationship has just ended. And that's really hard. And there's lots of grief in that and there's lots of sadness. But that's what you know right now. We don't know what's going to happen, whether you're going to find a new partner, whether you're going to, do whatever might happen next year. I mean, you might get on a cruise next week and move to Barbados, right? Like, who knows?
Yes.
But right here in this moment, what we do know is I feel sad, I feel grieving, or sometimes I feel great. And this uncertainty is kind of pulling me away from that. And so the really, really powerful stuff about right here and right now, I'm okay. Because I think that's the stuff that when we think about that evolution of our kind of ancestors and other things, that was kind of how they managed their world, right? They were present in their world until there was something that was an immediate danger, and then all of these systems would fire off. My guess is, and we're not there to have those conversations with them, but my guess is if they escaped this tiger, they'd know when they saw the tiger that that thing was going to be problematic, but they probably weren't then projecting about how many other ways the tiger was going to turn up.
Mm.
And so there's something really powerful about us just being really present in the moment. I'm sure your regular listeners have listened to loads of your guests talk about the science behind mindfulness, the science behind all this present focus stuff. I'm a pretty, for lack of a better word, pragmatic human, in that I know that most people aren't going to sit down and meditate for 20 minutes a day.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know anyone who does that. So full props to you if you do, but most people don't. But you can get 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 5 minutes. And so when I'm talking with people about getting present, I'm not talking about let's do this really complex thing. I'm talking about, what's it feel like when you rub your feet together, and can you be really present to that? Or if you're if you're sitting in your office, what are 5 things that you can hear right now? And just coming back to that. But I think that kind of dialogue that accompanies that around, in this moment, I'm okay, is really, really powerful. Even if in this moment it's really hard, because hard is okay too. That's what we're meant to do. We're equipped to bump into hard things.
We are, and so much of what makes life hard is what makes life meaningful.
Absolutely. And there's kind of a bit of a section in the book where I had a little bit of fun with this kind of thing. All right, well, let's get rid of uncertainty, right? Like, let's go, you know what? I can know everything. It's like, actually, that makes for a really, really miserable existence. Like, can you imagine the kind of joy that you would lose if every date you went on, you knew exactly whether it was going to work out or not? Or thinking about like things like you get a pet, but then you know when they were going to die. Like, you lose all of the joy. Our kind of purpose in life isn't to live without suffering or to live without hard things. And in fact, when I meet those people, well, I rarely meet those people, but it's usually that they feel really disconnected from the world, rather than because they can see that all of these things are happening to other people, but not necessarily understand them in the same way.
Yes.
So I think actually being really present to hard stuff shows up. That stuff's okay.
Yeah, and that's a really great place to finish. And I'd really love to connect our listeners today with you and your work. Where can people get a copy of the book? And I know you've got some webinars coming up. So how can people connect with you?
So probably the best place to find out kind of what I'm doing and things is probably my website, which is just my name.com.au. I am a reasonably vigilant, but not 100% awesome, up-to-date website person. So it's not the prettiest thing in the world, but it's okay. And people can contact me via that. If you just Google my name, you'll find me. I guess the other way, the book is kind of pretty much anywhere. You can find it. Your local bookshops can order it, or you can get it online. I am rubbish on social media, so there's almost no point trying to find me there. I have profiles set up in places, but I'm never on them. And often I get inquiries for people saying, oh, can I see you and stuff. Unfortunately, I work clinically in my day job, so I don't see patients outside of that. But if people are a bit lost, they can give me a shout and I can try and direct them to something that might be a bit helpful.
Oh, that is so kind of you. Thank you very much, Toni. And I'll put all of the information in the show notes. And I'm also going to put a link to a video about the book so that you can learn a little bit more about it. And thank you for writing it and sharing your expertise, which you've gathered through hardship, your own and other people's, and you are at the front line when it comes to uncertainty. And I know that can't be easy for you either, but your patients, after spending this time with you and reading your book, I know how lucky they are to have you with them. So thank you for all the wonderful work you do, and thank you so much for spending some of your very precious time with us here today.
Thank you, and that is very lovely to hear. Thank you. It's been an honour.
Oh, thanks so much. And thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us for another episode, and we'll be back with another one next week. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and leave a review. To keep the conversation going, I'd love you to join me over on Instagram. You'll find me at Dr Jodi Richardson. Also, if you'd like a copy of my free 5-day mini email course, Calm Your Anxious Brain, then jump over to my website, drjodirichardson.com, and you can sign up down the bottom. I've really enjoyed having your company. Thanks so much. See you next time.